we're actually moving on to our next section, I believe. There we go. So we're just going to go on to our next speaker before we have a short 10-minute break. So our next speaker is Professor Ennis Mckefney. I do apologise if I've said that wrong. Teaches architectural conservation at the Universities of Strathclyde and Edinburgh, and is currently contributing to the revised Buildings of Scotland volume for the Lothians. And his paper is The Best Collection of 17th Century Monuments in Scotland, the Earlier Court Style. So over to you, thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm hoping you can hear me, yes?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to start. The quote in my title is from historian John Gifford, who's buried here, and I'm going to focus very narrowly on just 5 monuments from the earlier part of the century. My starting point is to say that this is, or should be, a country noted internationally for its early medieval sculpture. Pictish sculpture might on merit be a nominated World Heritage Site, ditto Iona and the West Highlands sculpture. But these schools collapsed with the erasing of their cultures. But for our period, it was Reformation iconoclasm that made sculptors almost redundant, as the still empty image niches testify. Soon though, sculptors were needed again. I'm going to argue that a dramatic and significant shift in architecture and monumental design took place around the 1610s, and that this fashion flourished until around 1640, when Scottish society was nudging towards civil war and worse, as sculpture again was marginalised and architecture temporarily came to mean primarily forts. I'm going to argue too that the monuments I'm highlighting present some of the finest sculpture, constitute some of the boldest and most monumental of their time in the country, and, as a class or series, are of international interest. And I argue too that the factor these share is a connection with the royal craftsmen whose work elsewhere will note. As background, King James VI inherited as James I of England and Ireland in 1603, and although the monarchy emigrated permanently then, a fully operational royal works was left behind, lasting almost a century with the post of Master of Work or Royal Architect continuing, albeit stutteringly. My argument is that it was the patrons, architects, designers and sculptors associated with the absentee royal court who produced this series. Greyfriars was at the Reformation property of the Franciscan Friary, was gifted to the town as a burial place by Queen Mary in 1562, the St Giles burial ground having itself become awkwardly full, while the new church proposed in 1595 opened at last in 1620. An immediate oddity is that the first monuments all lie north of the church. Well, normal was, as with St Giles, normal was for the burial area to be to the south. But here the point is that the former yards and gardens were given over as a necropolis, possibly the country's first, so its story therefore is very different. Presbyterian reformers wanted a change for church architecture, stepping away from the east-west orientated nave and aisles formula, but here we have exactly that. So when I revisited the site for this talk, I couldn't help thinking the church looks earlier, pre-Reformation Gothic in fact. Okay, it's documented that ashlars from Sheen's convent should be reused here, also that in 1611 it was decided that the building should have pillars. But Episcopalians, resurgent from 1610 and preferring traditionalism, they might have dominated the decision-taking. Different quarries provided ashlars which here look incoherent, so the point of it reusing stones seems very plausible. The single original arcade bay with pillared bases suggests a mismatch between plinths and pillars, but were the bases already there in the 1590s? The Harrow prevents analysis of the walling, and I missed hearing what John Lawson thinks, but I would be unsurprised if the church incorporates or stands on a pre-Reformation structure. But what's that got to do with sculpture? Well, on the one hand, nothing. Except my first thought was that it seems significant to see so many first-generation monuments northeast of the church, because, as the placement of James V's statue at Stirling's Royal Palace shows, that was the important place for positioning the important person. I thought that if there was a church already existing when reforming hero George Buchanan was buried here in 1582, then might he have been placed at that corner? The same thinking made me wonder if this explains why so many of the sculptures line the northeast perimeter. Except another row lines the northwest perimeter too. But it does seem that the northeast side was densely populated and was used first. So I'm highlighting a question here, not an answer. Was the northeast corner's importance a factor in the early monument placement? As to these first generation monuments, these are variants of the model used for Master of Work William Shaw's memorial in Dunfermline by David Scougal about 1602. Its design is a platformed and horizontally shaped portal. The triumphal arch entrance to the triumph of the afterlife with pale pilasters, topped by a smaller feature, the whole thing classicizing or Renaissance. Here, the top feature is supported by scrolled brackets, not unlike, say, emblematic Renaissance pieces such as Alberti's Santa Maria Novella in Florence. The Greyfriars versions of the Shaw monument formula, whose character is fairly consistent, have a richer mannerist treatment than Shaw's, with deep textured surface decoration and emphasised jewel-like projections. One of 1610 was provided by George Heriot and his brother for their father. They all belong to the same sculptural family as the Shaw memorial. From the 1610s, the fashion, style, sophistication level and degree of classical discipline in architecture and monument design was changing very significantly, and it's this 1620s, 30s group that I'm focusing on. The new ideas were Netherlandish, a style well known to travelling Scots and promoted via publications. It combined with the Anglo-Dutch, then fashionable in England. So there were two deeply familiar neighbour sources for the new fashion. First up is a monument to Sir Robert Dennison of Mountjoy, the earliest of this group and the most readily seen today. Mountjoy was not the famous place in Ireland, but an estate near Linlithgow, also known as Meikle Parkley. Dennison, government official, diplomat, privy councillor and trusted royal servant, supporter of James's pressing for episcopacy, was also conservator of the Scots mercantile privileges in Viera, meaning that he knew both the king and Dutch architecture firsthand. He died wealthy, bequeathing to the poor of both Linlithgow and Stirling. His widow was Dame Christian Gibson, widow too of the royal physician Martin Schooner, who died in 1611. So, Dennison was a significant figure connected with the royal court, as was his widow through her two husbands. So, why would he or she not engage the top craftsmen, those who worked for the king? So the monument is in the new court style, an architecture familiar to the family through knowing Viera, contrasting with the earlier monuments in its upright form, differing ornament, strapwork, and in having single monolithic columns as against paired pilasters. These were amongst the first monolithic, that is, single stone, amongst the first monolithic columns in Renaissance Scotland. Now, though, let's cross to the Kirkyard's west side, where there's a group of mostly 1630s monuments in similar style, but each with instead paired monolithic columns, richer. The original entrance to the Kirkyard, as shown in Rothimay's map of 1647, was from the town, the Cowgate, and the north, and the retaining wall implies the boundary here was a steep bank, as there were always steps here for the cemetery. There was also a grand gateway, the present east entry, a lesser one at first. On this north approach, the monuments from the east side are at first seen only obliquely, particularly as screened by the avenue, but those on the west side are in immediate view, as the initial intention was to have monuments only against the walls. Then this monumental group would have been prominent on entering the courtyard, the Kirkyard. John Byers of Coates had been Edinburgh Treasurer, Baillie, Dean of Guild and Provost, and the special relationship between James VI and his favoured city of Edinburgh meant that its elites knew him. A 1615 date stone on Coates' house indicates he and his then wife Margaret Barclay having added to their house, maintaining its traditional form, that is, contrasting with the monument's modernity. And the Heidelberg-educated Bishop Thomas Sideserf, a foremost advocate of the royal demand for an episcopal Scotland, was Coates' son-in-law. The monument was by William Wallace, the King's Master Mason. George Fowlis, the first Laird of Ravelston, was an Edinburgh Baillie and councillor, but Here's a closer royal link. He was also Master of the Royal Mint, as was George, his son, the patron for this monument, and who had his own first wife, Christian Wardlaw, also commemorated by her own inscription. Christian's father was Sir Henry Wardlaw of Pitreavie, responsible for disbursements to the King's Masters of Work, and whose own Pitreavie house was rebuilt, also in this new style. And the family links there included Christian's sister Elizabeth marrying Sir Anthony Alexander, who was joint Master of Work from 1628. So here are direct links between the architectural need, the patrons, the royal architects, and therefore the court craftsmen. And the monument was by William Ayton in 1636. The elder Fowlis and Janet Bannatyne built or rebuilt Ravelston House for themselves. Stratwork and a monogrammed 1630 fountain are among surviving fragments matching this style. That is, unlike the courts in the 1610s, they embraced the new architectural fashion at home. The monument to Edward Henderson and Dame Helen Swinton was erected on 26th of September 1636 by their son, Sir Thomas, who was knighted in 1622, taking the title of Chesters. And again, there's a link to the royal court and thus direct access to the court's craftsmen. Chesters, Law Lord and Privy Councillor, was a staunch Episcopalian, that is, an important operative regarding the royal politico-religious policy. And the monument is curious insofar as, well, two things. Firstly, it's spectacularly belated, either 54 or 46 years late for the parents. And secondly, it serves for numerous family members. There are 27 people commemorated, including 3 sisters surnamed Heriot. Then the Thomas Bannatyne monument with Solomonic columns, it stands apart, suggesting it to be slightly independent of the others. It was provided by Janet McMath for her husband, who died in 1635. And I can't help noticing that George Fowlis of Ravelston's wife, Janet, was also surnamed Bannatyne. The top frame was returned to its place in recent years, but it was obviously intended to have a triplet top, but the finials for above the columns are lost, leaving it all a bit gaunt in profile. Anyway, are there any meanings we can draw from all this? I'm going to touch on 4 things: this new style, its patronage, the craftsmen, and then some slides of comparators. The new style. An immediately obvious thing is the contrast of this group with the earlier monuments. The Heriot one, for example, was made by John Simpson, a mason from the Royal Works, who was evidently a top specialist in 1610. The monument was a serious project, gilded to emphasise wealth, prestige, and sophistication. The fashion, though, changed around the 1610s with a superlative new quality, beginning possibly with the long-gone Earl of Dunbar's Berwick House, in which the Dutch sculptor John Gospel worked, as also in 1611, Master of Work James Murray worked too. The style was adopted for the palaces, by courtiers including Chancellor Seaton at Binkie, and for Civic Edinburgh at Parliament House. It was still popular in 1638, the date of the Skelmerley Monument. The best known example is, though, George Heriot's Hospital. As to the families, what seemed at first to be a series of visually related monuments now seems to comprise one group of 1, the Dennison one to the east, plus a second group of several opposite, 3 in a row plus 1 detached, but evidently in a chosen spot and planned layout backing onto the then Heriot's boundary. 2 of these constructed by and for a wide family group connected to the Heriot family and using the same specialists as worked at the hospital. The key family link was Helen Swinton. She was daughter of the Laird of Swinton, and she first married Robert Heriot of Limfoy, producing 3 daughters surnamed Heriot. And secondly, she married lawyer, classicist, and one-time University of Bourges professor, Master Edward Henderson, one of whose sons was Sir Thomas, patron for this memorial. Helen's daughter, Agnes Heriot, married Sir James Fowlis of Colinton, both named on the Henderson monument, one of whose sons was the first George Fowlis of Ravelston. Putting all that more simply, Helen Swinton was granny to the George who provided the Ravelston family monument, and she was mother to Sir Thomas of Chesters, who provided the Henderson one. So the patrons for these 2 monuments were second cousins. And big scale as this monument series is, these of 1636 are spectacularly monumental. I've not, though, found a link between Janet Vanitine and Thomas of the Vanitine family memorial, though George Vanitine was godfather to both her husband and father-in-law. And her husband's other godfather, by the way, was George Heriot the Elder. Nor have I found links with the Coates family, save the flimsy one that Coates and Ravelston both served on the council. But here Fowlis's, Henderson's, Bannatynes, and in the background the magic name Heriot, possibly a closer family group of elite clients responsible for 3 of this impressive and monumental series of memorials, 2 by craftsmen associated with the royal works, and all 4 stylistically following the Dennison monument. With the surname Heriot featuring as it has, a temptation is to suggest some of George Heriot's money might have spilled in the direction of the monument builders. However, as some families bequeathed generous sums afterwards to the poor, they were evidently independently wealthy, so I'm not proposing that. And as to the 2 craftsmen, each successively was top artisan at Heriot's Hospital. William Wallace, a carver in the Royal Works in 1616, was the following year appointed King's Master Mason. In 1627, he was appointed Master Mason to Heriot's Hospital, which began construction the following year. And he, as we saw, executed the Coates Memorial. He died in 1631, and his role at Heriot's was largely taken on by William Ayton. Ayton worked in the palaces and, as an architect, reconstructed Ennis House around 1640. He, as we saw, executed the Ravelston Monument. As a calligrapher, he made copies of the National Covenant in 1638, showing that this royal craftsman was now alienating himself from the crown. In 1628, stone for Heriot's came from Ravelston Quarry, implying a business transaction between the Heriot's project and the Ravelston family. Wallace had previously overseen quarrying there in 1625, 9 rigging stones for the King's badges in Stirling's Great Hall, while Fowlis had, meanwhile, had supplied lead for the Royal Works in 1633. And is this relevant? In 1631, James McMath became overseer and master of work at Heriot's. As he's unmentioned in the Royal Master of Works accounts, the likelihood is that he was totally non-artisan and therefore in a supervisory come design role. Is it significant that his surname is the same as one of our monument builders, Janet? Possibly he was the same James McMath who married a cousin of the younger George Fowlis? Maybe he was the same James McMath, formerly of Nijmegen, and certainly familiar, therefore, with Netherlandish architecture. But moving on, what we'll now see is the relationship between the monuments and other works, and we'll just look at some slides. So looking at similarities from within the monument group, what we see is, we see keystones on the left, which are almost identical. We see leathery base panels with cherubs. Similarities between the monuments and George Heriot's hospitals. If we look at the scrolled arch terminals, on the left-hand side, the Bannatyne and McMath Memorial, and on the right-hand side, George Heriot's Hospital, we see that the scroll terminal detail is identical. And dished portrait roundels. On the left-hand side, Ravelston family portraits. The roundels are set in a dish, and a dish-like profile. And on the right-hand side, Heriot's one of a series of royal images facing the courtyard. And here's looped tops on horizontal mouldings. The Bannatyne monument on the left, Bannatyne and McMath rather on the left, Ravelston, and on the right, Heriot's. Columns with crisscrossed spirals, Bannatyne and McMath monument on the left, and on the right, the Heriot's founder's niche. Then spiraled Solomonic columns with base clasps Bannatyne and Macmath monument on the left, and on the right, Heriot's. Again, we can see the similarity. And here's other similarities moving outside Edinburgh. Tented canopies associated with a diamond crest on the left, the Allison monument, then the Catherine Forbes memorial at Bencaitlin of 1639 in the middle, and on the right-hand side, a panel from Lady Yester's Church, Lady Yester's Kirk. And we finish this little series with the style's revival in the 19th century. So this style became fashionable in the 19th century, a sort of Heriot's revival style, perhaps. So, to conclude, I've sidestepped discussing the emblems because that's for specialists such as Michael Bath or Michael Pearce. And while noticing strong patron connections with Stuart episcopacy, what I'm arguing is that this 1620s, 30s group provides a major innovative series of monuments befitting a World Heritage Site, that family connections existed between some patron families and with the Heriots, that most, possibly all the families, cosmopolitan, New Europe, Low Countries architecture, where the style originated, also England, where the king promoted it. I've argued that the families were connected to the royal court and or the town council, whose closeness to the crown was notably strong, and that work needs done to get a clearer idea of the families and of this whole episode and wider topic. Also, that the monuments exemplify the court style, a rich style with a distinctive artistic repertoire, as this collage shows. A style which flourished amongst courtiers from the 1610s into the 40s, which was produced for two absent kings, James in 1617 and Charles in 1633, and which effectively ended with the warfare of the mid-century. When a normality returned in 1660, a new generation brought a new fashion, and this is where Christina's paper takes over from mine. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I enjoyed that immensely. You've answered some questions for me in my own head, so thank you so much. We'll be doing your Q&A session at the end once we've gone through everybody. So if I could invite you and everyone else to run off, make yourself a cup of tea or coffee, and we'll get back here for 3 o'clock. So it's only just a few minute break, but yeah, just get some refreshments. We'll see you soon. And welcome back, everyone. I hope you've all got your tea and coffee at hand, maybe even a glass of wine with it being the afternoon session. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Christina Gonzalez Longo. She is the founder and director of the MSc in Architectural Design for the Conservation of Built Heritage and the Architectural Design and Conservation Research Unit at the Department of Architecture of the University of Strathclyde. That's quite a mouthful you had there for me, Christina. You're still on mute just now, but Christina's paper is Robert Milne of Balfargie and Mr. James Smith of Whitehill, Masons and Architects at Greyfriars at the end of the 17th century. So I'm going to hand you over to Christina now, and looking forward to this one.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. Thanks very much to Susan also for the invitation. I was really thrilled to be part of this. So I'm going to talk to you about two architects, or many architects, because how I always describe to visitors, Greyfriars is the kirkyard of architects, from Craig to Adam and of course the Milne family. So we know, actually we have some documents mentioning both Milne and Smith working at the actual church, the kirk, adding some monuments, some statues. They are mentioned on the top and also in the nearby George Heriot. And something I need to kind of qualify all about is this always for our research we take the material evidence, but also the documentary evidence. And in this case, as in many cases, it's tricky because they're having reconstruction. You know, as you can see, the church here, the kirk, had actually two major events. What makes what we look today that further studies will be required, including material, more detailed material analysis. So I think it's, from what we see, this I think will require a more in-depth analysis to really be more certain. First, talking about Robert Milne, and probably you all know about him. And if you visit Holyrood, you see a very prominent stone in a corner marking the starting date of the reconstruction, 1671. He comes from a family of master masons of many generations before him, starting with John Milne, master masons, and actually his daughter is also mentioned by Colvin as being very good drawer and very clever, but unfortunately he didn't put the reference. So I've been for years trying to find out where he found that. But this is, I think someone mentioned in the morning, is this hidden history of women involved in the work. And as you can see in this genealogy, in this tree, there is no one woman. And I just, this was actually a portrait commissioned by her husband, the other second architect I'm talking about, Mr. James Smith of Whitehill. So they were actually, Robert Milne and was the father-in-law of James Smith. So that's an important connection. And as I said, the main work known of Robert Milne is Holyrood, and took quite a bit of his time. And it's an interesting project, and interesting to research on and see what is really the evolution of this very important project. And interesting, a big change that happened. So the original plans actually were, as you see in the top, to keep these two towers, not changing much the facade. And then radical change comes in 1676, where this grand portal appears into the design. And why this comes, I really think comes from the fact that Smith is back from Rome, 4 years in Rome, not to be, he didn't go there to be study architecture, although maybe a hidden agenda he had and we still don't know. He went to become a priest. So he spent 4 years at the Collegio Romano, and these were very formative, important years for his later career. His dad was a master mason, so for sure he has some training, because he went there when he was 25, at the time considered to be very mature student. That was just the limit accepted at the Scots College in Rome to study there. And for me, this facade really changed the trajectory of architecture in Scotland. So this is actually, you see this dress as a student priest, seminarians, is in the front of the actual chapel where the Scots College was, Via delle Quattro Fontane in Rome. So that's the closest we can go to figure out how Smith looked like. It's very strange that such an important person didn't have really a portrait. And there was the Rome around his time, a little bit earlier. And the picture I just show you is in this side of the street, Via delle Quattro Fontane. Across the road was the Barbarini Palace. And actually the Cardinal Barbarini was the protector of the Scots College. And at the time, there were only 4 students, so it's quite assumed that they will have a quite close contact, and at the time the palace was undertaking quite a lot of work as well. And Smith comes back to Edinburgh actually, and does a project with Wisbury House, which actually was the architect for the conversion. Very similar, you see the evolution of that project. So we know he was very committed when he was there, and has this oath of promising obedience, but then he decided to change his mind and just abandon and becomes an apostate, actually, is how it's recorded. The year he comes back is a year of jubilee, so grand architecture was being built, and I think that made a huge impression of him. And in fact, this drawing you see here on the bottom is one of his attributed drawings now at the RIBA archives in London. And he's traveling back. Remember, they were coming by walking with some maybe boats, short boat trip through rivers, and of course in the channel. And we know that by January 1676, there is a letter that confirms that he's in London. But there are sometimes there we don't know where he was, and we have some travel expenses paid by William Bruce, so there is a connection already from 1677. We have also the first from Holyrood is 1678, and is talking specifically about the main entrance of Holyrood. So going now back to Robert Milne, we know from the town council, from the minutes, that this tomb, that the little wall monument that you see there is by Robert Milne, and is for Alexander Bethune of Long Hermiston. And it's interesting because why Milne is mentioned is because that timing is really, this is 1674 is just when the work stopped for some moment in Holyrood. So it's kind of, he fitted this job in between this very important work. And of course he gets mentioned because he's a very prominent architect, but also it's interesting to see how it fits. And Ennis has just been talked about this Dennison, and I think it's a bit of a statement that why this monument is fitted in between is really different to what is around it. Normally the Milne monument, which is the Milne family designed by Robert Milne, gets mentioned as the first of this kind of more classical monuments. But in fact, there is a bit of doubt, and the fact that his descendant, Milne, who wrote the book of the Master Masons of Scotland, seems to be quite accurate. He says that the tomb was erected when he died in 1710. So again, back to my first slide saying that things have to really be checked further, because there are sometimes documents, and in this fact the warrant was 1674, but it could well be another different monument. So things has to be further studied. The Bethune monument gets actually a railing when it's reused, and that's one of the characteristics. No? We found these tombs continuously reused, and we'll hear Chris Cooper talking later on the amount of tombs that are in that precinct. So this is the Bethune monument, and as you can see, has this characteristic mixture of the pagan and the Christian and the classical, and a bit of more folk art, as we could consider. And so the classical order that we can see here, very, very clear with the pediment and the capitals, Corinthian order. And also this symbolism, no? To like the ancient Greek wing figure of Psycho, with this angel head. And actually, if you go around, you will find that, and because the stylism of the carving, you can actually declare some authorship, identify some authorship of the different architects of Masons. And the Green Man has been mentioned this morning as well, that this was uncommon, and they consider it's the first time here in Greyfriars, but just to remember that, you know, it gets used in other places as well, and this is a capital from Milan, and it's one of the places that Smith will have crossed probably in his path back to Scotland. And there is also a building by Smith where he mixes a bit of this classical with more vernacular or folklore elements, but this comes out actually also from Caramuel treatises. So he has a high component of theoretical, contemporary theoretical thinking into his work. Vitruvio, and this gets mentioned in the actual tomb of the Milnes, is still a big reference. So it's what all reference make the reference to. But what appears also at this time more is Palladio, the use of Palladio. In fact, we have a receipt from Sir William Bruce, who buys in 1676, so that's the date, the book. And we can see the obvious relationship with the entrance of Holyrood on the right. And I consider this change in this architecture of Scotland just the things we have been hearing from Ennis, what was happening before. So there were influences, but they were looking more perhaps to the north of Europe, that again comes in the first instance also from Rome, no? The influences. But my argument here is this entrance, which for me is a change really in the architecture of Scotland. From that moment on, architecture is different. It is piloted in Greyfriars and is piloted in these monuments, in these wall monuments. Perhaps this could have been by a Smith, is James Chalmers, and there is a date, but the actual construction is a bit later, no? 1672. But observe the inscription, what says revised, but William Wilson, 1834. So what we are seeing in Greyfriars, and we know some monuments around the Bethune actually were dismantled and put it back. So things have to be reserved with a lot of attention if we don't want to make mistakes, let's say. But what is, the Greyfriars is really a reflection of the culture of the time, not only the architectural culture, but the wider, I will say, culture. And at the end of 17th century, architecture was very much at the center of even, social discussion almost. And around the contract, the work of Holyrood is where this relationship was made, were made. So it's this very revealing contract of 1672, where there are people that then will see that, like John Cunningham, no? We'll see the tomb to his wife in Greyfriars as well. And it's about these writers of designate, advocates, and architects, masons. So this kind of, were the component that evolved this work, and then the ones who went buried. And Vignola, maybe it doesn't get mentioned as much as it should, because Vignola was the one that kind of standardized the use of the orders, and Smith very much related to Vignola. And also not just in terms of the contents of the book, but these frontispieces. Sometimes they were really importing almost to actual work. And remember, the books will be not as common as they are for us, so they were quite precious reference elements. And in what we found in Bethune monument is a real, relation to the classical order, and really an intention, clear intention to do a standardized or kind of well-recognized quality classical order in order to relate to the important architecture happening at the time. And around this signet library, the advocates, this is really where the center of culture occurs at the time. And the architects are friends with, and remember they are called senators as well. And Edinburgh before wanted to be Athens, wanted to be Rome, and this is a pedestal that Smith with Milne did for the statue of Charles II. And you can see here that this stone wants to be like the travertine in the Roman stone of travertine, no? And it's great leaf stone. I asked a geologist, but it really was selected carefully to look like a stone. And that's where the next mausoleum in Greyfriars I'm looking at happens is Sir George Mckenzie. So he was really important, cultivated person. It's a pity that is only sometimes remembered as the Bloody Mckenzie, but he was really influential, and Smith did also a house for him, and Smith gets to do the house and the tomb for his client, which is quite interesting. And you can see the old picture here, the obvious references to Bramante, Tempietto in Rome, but for me more the Reginald Pole chapel in the Via Appia Antica in Rome, and Smith getting Ramranrick also to kind of trial a bit that earlier on, and then does this, which, as you can see, is in quite poor state at the moment. And in terms of elements that is incorporated in the architecture within this classical, more kind of standardized language of architecture, which is more established at the time, he integrates these elements of, as I say, more the folklore, and is this the Green Man, but also is this sort of mask that appears in Ramlanri Castle. There are all these elements that this is the Collegio Romano in Rome where Smith studies, and this is the actual Canongate church by Smith as well. And so you can see directly influences, and it's what I think what Charles McKean will have called this Scottish accent made itself heard. So it's taking this international Roman architecture, but then is brought here and is really interpreted. So that's modern. And this is Smith doing for the Duke of Wisbury, the tomb, as well as his house. And you are an architect is as good as his clients are. And where in Hamilton, perhaps he went a bit backwards in the development of the style. So he's more going to the first half, perhaps, of the 17th century, that what he was doing with the Queensberries, no? And mentioning also in Greyfriars the tomb of Thomas Robertson, who was a builder that worked with Smith. And I wonder if it was a relative of William Robertson that was mentioned this morning, that was minister. That's why he gets that prominent place. Again, could have been relocated. So further investigation requires. And not only the presence of Smith are not only through the tombstone, but also gates that I can find some references. For example, this entrance in New Hales, his own house. And James Smith became what was recognized as the most experienced architect of that kingdom. And it's interesting because, say, by Colin Campbell, the writer of Scottish and the Vitruvius Britannicus, he was a lawyer who became an architect. So this relationship eventually became even in that way, you know, that becomes himself an architect. And Smith goes and do these important buildings, and that's why he gets this qualification of the best architect of the time, that he really changed a lot the architecture, and the reminiscences are still seen, and is how the architecture evolved later on with the Adam family and others in Britain. So for me, Greyfriars is really a cultural heritage site of high significance, and is where the tangible and intangible are integral parts. So it's a reflection of the culture, as I say, and the society of the time, and they are high architectural and craftsmanship quality. They encapsulate the culture, it's a developing culture, but also shows the constraint of people, even with high status, like the saying that they have to squeeze in between tombs because there was a lack of available space, or they wanted to have that more prominent space. And it's really shows these changes. And for me, is this testing ground that what became later Holyrood. In particular, the entrance, they was really trying these smaller monuments in that kind of gap of time between the two main phases of the construction. And I really think it's just that the dates are just they tie up just too well together to attribute to Smith the change, although obviously this Bethune tomb with the date of is just before he appeared. So my argument is that Robert Milne and Smith were in contact before he came back to Scotland. And in fact, I could bring it further and say that he actually went to Scotland when the Holyrood started building, and that was the main trigger for him wanting to go and maybe to become a priest. Maybe that was the excuse to be there. That's maybe pushing a bit too far, but overall, we have to also talk about conservation, and it's very much my subject as well. And the conditions are very poor. Urgent work is required, and it's very important we don't lose such an important architectural and cultural heritage. We really need to do a recording. This is my drawings a long time ago when I, just by hand measuring things, we have a means of 3D scan that can be done in the monuments. There are techniques that we can be analyzing further the condition of the stone and intervening, because really it's a pity to see monuments in such a state, and I think could be a fantastic, and hopefully with the new group, this is incentivized. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Christina. I always love listening to your lectures, and especially when we had our little walk around the graveyard a few years ago. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And you'll be around for questions and answers at the end of this, won't you?
Yep.
That's great. So we're going to move on to our next paper, and this is by Chris Cooper, who is not only our very own treasurer of the Friends of Greyfriars Kirkyard, but he's also a long-standing supporter of the site. In 2016, he published his research on John Bain of Piccarelli, who was writer to the Signet. So Chris's paper, John Bain, his Mausoleum, the story so far.
This is my presentation where I give you the background to John Bain, writer to the Signet. I describe my experiences of researching this mausoleum, and I tell you what I've discovered, and also all the other things I have still yet to discover. I express my concerns about the lack of conservation for the tombstones and mausoleums in the kirkyard, and also my support for the Friends of Greyfriars Kirkyard. This is a picture of John's early home, which was close to what is known as the John Knox house, on the north side of the house High Street. John's father was a bowmaker, and this would have been John's early home. John was born in Edinburgh, he worked in Edinburgh, and he was buried in Edinburgh. Later on in life, he moved up the High Street, and he had property on the south side of the High Street, close to the junction with Parliament Place. This would have put John right in the middle of the political and commercial heart of Scotland. Towards the end of his career, he became a minor laird, owning a couple of small estates, and he finished his life by being a generous benefactor to various charities. This is a picture showing the junction with the High Street and Parliament Place in the close proximity where John Bain would have lived. John was a writer to a Signet. This was a prestigious legal profession to belong to. It did not have the same status as being an advocate, but being a writer to the Signet was a government post held in high esteem. John qualified in 1655, and from the epitaph, which was originally on his tombstone, there is the inscription that reads, "To the memory of that most learned man, the famous writer to the Signet." Then also in a book written by George Dallas, one of his apprentices, Dallas quotes him as saying that John Bain was a great penman in his age and so known. So clearly he was a person of some distinction. So now we move to the discussion about the mausoleum. And in 1681, John Bain died. And 3 years later, his wife, Euphay Maidman, she applied to the town council for permission to erect a monument. There's no record of anybody else representing her application, so I assume she was there by herself. The council minutes quote that the application will much beautify the said kirkyard, so they must have been pleased with the proposals. And the minutes then went on to say that she had permission to erect the same of what figure or form that she thinks fit. So this is not very specific in terms of describing the proposed mausoleum or the statue, but it seems as if she was given plenty of freedom to design the mausoleum of her choice. Know who built the mausoleum? For in Euphay Makeman's will, it identifies 5 tradesmen. There was Philip Allison, mason, Patrick Hunter, mason, James Anderson, painter, Robert Young, a wright, and George Mitchell, a smith. I'm going to focus on 2 of these tradesmen. And here we have a copy will held at the National Records Office, and it talks about Philip Allison Mason. Now, he had a contract for 3,000 merks for building the tomb in Greyfriars Kirkyard. It mentions a tomb, it doesn't mention the statue, but it seems that he had the main contract. Now, Euphay, she died in 1686, so Philip at this stage had already predeceased her, and so it's a long time before he or his family received his money. Philip Allison, he was a warden at the incorporation of Mary's Chapel, which is an indication that he must have been a senior person within his guild. The other tradesman I'd like to talk about is James Anderson, and here he is down here. And he was paid £80 for colouring, painting and gilding the said tomb. Now, this came as a surprise to me because I was under the impression that the culture at the time was to have modest tombstones. Yet here we have a very flamboyant design and something which would have been colourful and bright. I just wonder whether painting and gilding of tombstones was the fashion of the day. But who was the architect for the tomb? Well, the main contenders are Sir William Bruce. He was an architect. He was a work colleague of John Bain, and in later life, there was evidence to show that he was a personal friend because he became one of the patrons of the student bursaries funded by John Bain's will. Robert Milne, another contender, His Majesty's Master Mason, and an excellent sculptor. James Smith worked with Sir William Bruce and Robert Milne on Holyrood Palace. So they were all known to each other. Now it is James Smith who has a special attention because it was he who spent 4 years in Rome. And he would have had a great opportunity to have looked at, sketched, recorded the architecture of this city. It's felt that he would have brought these drawings or sketches back to Scotland and may be the source of the Piccarelli design. He's also recorded as being a good sculptor. Unfortunately, as yet, I have found no written record to record who was the architect who designed Piccarelli's mausoleum. So why is it so special? Well, these pictures show on the left John Bain's mausoleum, which is situated on the north side of Greyfriars Kirkyard. And you can see it's like a Roman arch. There are 3 arches. and John Bain is hidden out of view because he's against the back wall. I have included this photograph, which I came across by chance, and this is a photo of the European cemetery in Guti in India, and I think it dates around the 1820s. I like the similarity between the two. I like the fact that this mausoleum is bright and cheerful, and I think it gives us a suggestion that when Piccarelli's tomb was erected, that it too would have been a very colourful and bright structure, and not the dark structure that we see now. So the question is, how on earth did this design appear in Edinburgh, in Greyfriars Kirkyard in 1684? Let's look more closely now at some of the working on the mausoleum. So here we have John Bain. He's set back in a niche. He's holding in his left hand a purse. Either side of him, we have trumpeting angels. And we can see in this enlarged photograph, we have the wings, the two wings, and the head, the mouth, and the mouth is blowing into the trumpet, which comes down. And here we have one hand and the second hand holding the trumpet. We are looking here at the underside of the roof. And what's interesting is the amount of effort that has gone into decorating this roof space. Difficult to describe to you, but it has been recorded that this area and this area represent flying angels. And here is a scroll where there are a few letters of the Bain family motto, which was et art et mart, by skill and strength. Here we are in Edinburgh on a sunny day, casting nice sunshine and shadows, showing the cherubs which adorn the outside of the mausoleum, and just looking at the detail that the craftsman spent working on these columns. Just like to focus now on John Bain holding his purse with his left hand. On the internet, there are lots of comments about the fact that he was holding this purse to show off his money, and then that the purse symbolized his wealth. Elsewhere, it's been recorded that the date inscribed on the purse was 1658. However, having looked at it on numerous occasions, it's my view that the inscription is 1655, the date that John Bain qualified as a writer to the signet. To me, the essence of this statue is to represent a famous writer to the signet. Therefore, the purse is more likely to contain the royal signet than to contain a bag of money. Here we have a full-length photograph of John Bain, and you can see either side we have the skull and crossbone on his flanks. And here on both sides, not on this photograph, but here, these are blank plates. And I think it may be possible that the inscription, the epitaph for the mausoleum was situated here. But unfortunately, it's eroded, it's gone, and we will never see it again. So who carved the statue? As yet, we do not know. Yet more disappointment. Philip Allison, the mason, did he do both the mausoleum and the statue? Unfortunately, the records don't say so. Another contender is James Smith, surveyor to the Royal Works. And I'd like to just sort of quote this little reference that I came across. This is correspondence from Sir William Dunbar, and he's in the process of having 3 family paintings copied. and he asked that Mr. John Scougal, who was a famous portrait painter at that time, to draw 3 faces for his use, to be copies for 3 statues. And then the reference goes on that they are to be made by Mr. Smith, Master Mason. So it doesn't prove anything, but it does put James Smith in as a possible contender for someone who may have carved the statue. Now, if I talk about the mausoleum in more sort of general terms, this is an old photograph, and it's showing a tombstone that was lying at the front of the mausoleum. It's a useful record in that that tombstone is no longer visible. Who it belongs to, I don't know. It could be Euphane Aikman, because we know she was buried in the enclosure. It could be her brother Andrew, who was also buried there. Or it could relate possibly to James Cathcart, because he bought the estate of Piccarelli, and with the estate came the ownership of the mausoleum and enclosure in the kirkyard. So he then inherited the right to be buried there. So further research is required to see whether we can identify who this tombstone belongs to. Yet more research, yet more puzzles. Here's a photograph taken by Joe Rock, and we have these ball finials on the pedestals, but these, there's some sort of doubt about the authenticity of these balls. Joe Rock says when he visited that there were columns which used to be in this position at the front, and they were broken and lying on the ground, and they would have stood where the ball finials were. So this calls into doubt where these ball finials came. Did they come from up on high, and had they been taken down for safety's sake, or have they been brought in from another tomb for safekeeping? The point is, when looking at these photographs, you don't really realize how much the mausoleum has changed and whether or not this was part of the original sort of design. This photograph, a later photograph, shows the same pedestal at the front of the mausoleum, and unfortunately this ball finial has come off the pedestal and has been smashed into pieces, and they are no longer to be seen. Here, a photograph of the top corner of the roof of the mausoleum, showing huge gaps, and no doubt with water ingress, it will be leading to lots of damage to the structure. It's been like that for a long time. There are signs that it has been pointed in the past, but urgent maintenance is needed to help restore this property. This is a Grade A building, and I travel up from Nottingham to look at my favourite spot. It's 300 miles and it takes 5 hours to drive there. So you can imagine my disappointment when I encounter something like this. And it's to our shame that we cannot have adequate resources to keep this Grade A building in a decent condition. Here we're inviting visitors to the city to come to this special mausoleum, yet people can't see the mausoleum for the tall buddleia which is growing. A photograph of John Bain. I believe that his nose has been chiselled off, and there's evidence that someone has given him a moustache. Here, by contrast, is a painting of George Dallas, or a copy painting, I should say. And this copy painting is held in the entrance hall to the Signet Library next to Parliament Hall. Now you notice that John has been disfigured and vandalised, whereas George Dallas has not. George lives in a nice, secure environment. There are reception staff who can keep an eye on the painting, even though it is a public place and a busy place. Yet no one has managed to scrape his nose off or give him a moustache. That's because it's under supervision, and at night he's locked up safely. My point is, I would like both these portraits to be treated the same and to hold the same value. And just as George Dallas has got security, I would like the same for John Bain of Piccarelli. This is John Trotter and Janet McMath. They died in 1641, and they had this mural monument erected. Now, one of their family members took it upon himself in 1709 to commission Robert Milne, master mason, to build this protective vault. So far as I know, this monument has not been desecrated in any way. So the protective vault has been a success. It does mean that members of the public are denied access, but on the other side, it means that the monument is well protected. Perhaps we need to think about what level of protection we need to give to our vulnerable monuments elsewhere in the Kirkyard. And finally, I'd just like to say, well, John and I have become very close friends. He's old now, and I worry that he may collapse anytime soon. He needs urgent help. John has taught me so much history and provided stories about his many friends also buried here in the Kirkyard. I'd like John and his stories to last forever, and that's why I've joined Friends of Greyfriars Kirkyard. I'd like to ask whether you too can help.
Now, that was another wonderful talk by Chris, and I know that it's a monument very close to his heart, as it is to many of ours. So thank you ever so much for that, Chris. So we're going to move on to our final speaker for the day. I'm quite disappointed that the day is nearly over with. It's been such a fantastic day. So next we move on to Tarragon Kelham, who's a final year fine art MA student at the University of Edinburgh and practicing artist at the Edinburgh College of Art. The paper is entitled Afterlives in Stone, an exploration of 17th century monumental funerary sculptures in Greyfriars Kirkyard. Kirkyard, Edinburgh, with particular reference to the little mausoleum. Over to you, Tarragon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I will just start by saying that today I will take you on a journey past Greyfriars Bobby, immortalised in bronze, and through the main entrance of the Kirkyard. Left along the east wall beside the Milne enclosure, eminent master masons to the monarch of Scotland. Following the path by the south wall, one is tempted to continue towards the imposing domed mausoleum of Bloody Mckenzie, a notorious Covenanter prosecutor. Stopping shy of this monolith, behind ornate iron railings lies a figure in easy recline, resting atop a stone sarcophagus. Canopied by an ogee domed roof and surrounded by 10 delicate, smooth and fluted Corinthian columns, the little Peristyle mausoleum is a unique feature in the remarkable necropolis of Greyfriars Kirkyard. The structure of the little mausoleum can more clearly be observed in this 19th century illustration. The monument lacks the deep relief carving, strapwork decoration, and rich, weird and anecdotal ornament that characterizes many early tombs, such as this unknown and unattributed tomb in Greyfriars Kirkyard. Instead, the little mausoleum takes its cue from classical architecture, prioritizing architectural features, symmetry, and vertical linearity above heavy service ornament. Every feature of the funerary sculpture works together to center the viewer's gaze, draw the eye upward and deliver an elegant impression of height and monumentality. Yet on my first approach to the mausoleum, my eye was immediately caught by a shiny silver plaque fixed in the enclosure railings, identifying the structure as a fraternal monument dedicated to Clement and William Little, two 16th century residents of Edinburgh. The plaque provides the non-classically educated among us with a translation as the crumbling inscription on the sarcophagus within. What Clement was, how great that little were, these citizens, that bibliothèque declare. This noble pair of brethren did contend, in merits great, each other to transcend. For both did good, this to their mother town, that to the muses, whence came their renown. The plaque also serves to commemorate what the Edinburgh Evening News dubbed, at the time in 2001, at an event organised by the Clan Little Society, a little celebration. This was to mark the 400th anniversary of the death of William Little. The Society put out a call for Littles to meet at the Little Mausoleum, Greyfriars Kirkyard, for a ceremonial unveiling of this plaque by the Lord Provost and to pay homage to their shared ancestors. The physical congregation of Littles, coupled with the officiating presence of the Lord Provost, indicates the active potential of the Little Mausoleum centuries after its construction and its efficacy in achieving what is, according to Peter Sherlock, who's a great scholar in funerary sculpture, a monument's one primary task, to attract visitors and to make them remember the dead. Like discovering your first clue on a scavenger hunt, it became immediately evident that the Little Mausoleum is more than a beautiful micro-architectural monument to some long-dead worthies of the city, but functions as a tangible link in a chain that connects the present to a historical moment and individuals in history. So as the initial step in my research into the Little Mausoleum, I looked up the Clan Little Society and sent an email to their secretary, Tom Little. Tom, shown here, explained the importance of the Little Mausoleum to members of his society across the globe, from America to Europe to Australia and New Zealand. On sending me this photo, Tom said, "I do not just want to insert my ego here and attach a photo of myself when I visited this churchyard in 2017, but I want to help you know that this history is important to us." So who are or were Clement and William Little? How was the Little Mausoleum so significant as to inspire such engagement from disparate communities across the globe? Though the exact dates are unknown, Clement and his younger brother William were born in the 1520s in Edinburgh. Their lives spanned a period of immense change in Scottish society. In 1560, as I imagine has previously been discussed, Protestantism was officially adopted by the Scottish Parliament, with Catholics debarred from office, leaving a vacuum in key arenas of power, which Clement, William, and other prosperous figures in the professional classes of Edinburgh were adroitly placed to exploit. Clement, the scholar of the family, was educated at St Leonard's College, St Andrews, and Louvain University, returning to Edinburgh to begin a career in advocacy in 1553. Clement rapidly climbed the ranks of Edinburgh's social, religious, and political elites, becoming both procurator for the Kirk, responsible for collecting Kirk revenues, and one of 3 advocates for the Kirk. Additionally, Clement was one of the 4 Edinburgh commissaries, whose role included drawing up the document that legally enforced the abdication of Mary, Queen of Scots, in favour of her infant son. Though little in name, William, like his brother, fulfilled the family motto, magnum in parvo, much in little, accomplishing a great deal during his lifetime. While the learned bibliophile Clement favoured the muses, William's concerns were of a more earthly nature. The carved inscription on the sarcophagus describes his having fostered the capital of his country. Indeed, inheriting his father's cloth business, William developed the economic standing of the Little family, cultivating patronage of the royal court. It is testament to his success that this cloth merchant's son was twice elected as Provost of Edinburgh, the most senior position in the nation's capital, and by royal recommendation, no less, succeeding James Stuart, Earl of Arran, Chancellor of Scotland, who was a long-time favourite of King James VI. Yet perhaps most critical for the very existence of this paper, William Little and his brother, alongside James Lawson, John Knox's right-hand man and heir to the ministry of St. Giles, played central roles in the establishment of the University of Edinburgh. In a post-Reformation Edinburgh, without the authority of the old church, which had previously provided the episcopal patronage necessary for the establishment of a university, Edinburgh's fledgling college would need something else on which to grow its reputation. Cue Clement's library. Throughout his life, Clement had collated hundreds of important texts and manuscripts, ranging from salvaged detritus of the Scottish Reformation to inheritances from eminent figures, such as this slide demonstrates. He inherited this book from the Earl of Moray, later Regent of Scotland, and also figures like Robert Reid, Bishop of Orkney. Clement's library had the potential to be the seed from which an organisation of international significance would grow. However, dying without issue in 1580, Clement willed his library not to the prospective university, but divided his literary assets between friends, colleagues, and his widow, and gave his theological tomes to the exclusive keeping and use of the Kirk of Edinburgh. It was in fact William Little's machinations in his position as Burgess, brother, and only executor of Clement's will that this gift was redirected from the Kirk into the possession of Edinburgh University. So whilst Clement provided the texts that currently lie within the treasures room of the University of Edinburgh Library, it was William who facilitated their placement there and ultimately provided the literary nucleus around which the university could be established. As the president of the Carnegie Corporation, another great Scottish bibliophile and benefactor stated, "No university in the world has ever risen to greatness without having a correspondingly great library, and no university is greater than its library." So returning from the corpus of these texts to the bodies of the little brothers themselves, why did it take 100 years after the deaths of Clement in 1580 for William Little's great-grandson to construct a monument commemorating the two brothers? With the average life expectancy in Scotland before the 18th century estimated at 32 years, this 100 years is a significant chasm of time. It is also clear that the brothers did not want for worldly achievement in order to credit a physical memorial. To understand this delayed commemoration, we must consider the context in which the brothers both lived and died. The Scottish Reformation, occurring 40 years after that of its southern neighbour, was decidedly Calvinist or Reformed Protestant in nature, instituting severe measures on burial practices and ceremonies exceeding those in England, the most conspicuous of which dictated that bodies must be interred outside the kirk in a secret and convenient place lying in the most free air. Many of the leading church reformers, including John Knox himself, were buried without physical grave markers. Indeed, this slide includes an excerpt from a poem from James Lawson dedicated to Clement Little after his death, praising him for leaving a material legacy of books rather than an extravagant tomb monument. However, in 1645, the Directory for Public Worship of God gained parliamentary approval, and it presented a more moderate tone in respect to death and burial. Whilst reiterating the Kirk's forbidding of intramural burials and prohibition of funerary practices, or certain funerary practices, the 1645 reforms departed from the egalitarian practices promoted by early reformists. Instead, burial that was suitable to the rank and condition of the party deceased whilst he was living was endorsed, thereby promoting the erection of funeral monuments that were reflective of the deceased status in life. As the 17th and 18th centuries went on, Edinburgh was becoming a booming mercantile metropolis, initially established outside the city walls in keeping with reformist ideas regarding the separation of living bodies from those of the dead. The growing city soon enveloped Greyfriars Kirkyard. We can see the extent of the development in these two slides. One, a map created in 1647, and this one in 1742. I've highlighted here Greyfriars Kirkyard and this wynd, up here Liberton's Wynd, which no longer exists, unfortunately, which is where the Littles had a townhouse, just to highlight the close proximity of the Littles, their accommodation in death rather, and the accommodation of the Littles in life. Consequently, Greyfriars was gaining a position of growing geographical and social prominence, and even seems to have functioned as a kind of thoroughfare with pathways running between Heriot's Hospital, Candlemaker Row, and the Cowgate. the increasingly prominent location of the kirkyard and the relaxation of attitudes to post-mortem commemoration transformed Greyfriars into a desirable location for the very public commemoration of members of the developing upper middle class of Edinburgh. This is in contrast to the burial of aristocratic figures in this period. Those who could claim noble lineage and had access to huge sums of capital constructed commemorations within purpose-built or converted burial aisles, distinct from the main body of the kirk, such as the Lauderdale monument within a converted sacristy in St Mary's Kirk, Haddington. Instead, Clement and William Little are memorialised amongst their peers, amongst monuments dedicated to the developing upper middle class of Edinburgh, including the Fowlis, Naismith and Piccarelli families, physically demonstrating the Littles' membership within this new social strata. This is particularly significant as due to the economic and social legacy built by the brothers, particularly William Little, the Little family became prominent landowners in Liberton, today a suburb of Edinburgh. With William Little's acquisition of the barony in Over Liberton in 1587, the family became minor landed gentry, expanding their sphere of influence beyond the confines of the city. The dominion of the Littles over Liberton was solidified in the form of Liberton House, shown on this slide, constructed in 1600 and occupied by the descendants of the Little family until the 1960s. The patron of the Little Mausoleum, William Little's great-grandson, the fourth generation of his family to be called William, I'll call him William Little IV for clarity, left a record of his occupation and development of Liberton House in the form of this sundial, 1683, and this carved pediment dated 1675, is that, sorry, chat box is over it, to further cement his activities and his significance in the locale. So it could have been a quite natural decision on the part of William Little IV to construct a monument to his antecedents in Liberton Kirk to further cement the family position there. However, it's likely that William Little IV considered it to be most advantageous for the living Littles to commemorate the family in a central, prominent location of Greyfriars, amongst such company as previously mentioned. This is particularly acute in light of my investigations into the genealogy of the Little family. Next slide. So we can see William Little, who is here. So William Little IV, rather, and his great-grandfather here. He only had one descendant, Janet Little. And in this period, there was, I guess, an insecurity about potential legal disputes and the fractioning of the Little inheritance. So under this strain, it is likely that William Little IV was motivated to build the monument in Greyfriars Kirkyard, as legal contestations were registered by Walter Rankin and Sarah Little in favour of their sons William, who changed his name from Rankin to Little and did indeed inherit the Little estate. So the monument in Greyfriars Kirkyard functions for William Little IV to cement the legitimacy of his position as head of the Little family while he lived, materialising the bonds of ancestry and solidified the hereditary rights to the social and economic status accrued by his predecessors of William Little and Clement, and secured the inheritance of his descendants, whether that be direct descendants or otherwise. Despite the fact that Greyfriars was selected as the location for the Little Mausoleum, for all the reasons I previously outlined, it's fascinating on visiting Liberton Kirk just how strong the influence of the Little family must have been, particularly in respect to burial convention. So this slide demonstrates a tablestone monument dedicated to William Stratton, and I think it's incredibly revealing how the effigy shown here, though headless, reflects the effigy of the Little Mausoleum. However, he's replaced in the Stratton case the pillow with a sheath of corn to reflect his occupation in life as a gentleman farmer. To finish, I wish to highlight for you one notable characteristic of the Little Mausoleum, which demonstrates the importance of an art historical approach and visual analysis to the tombs of Greyfriars. In the wake of the Reformation, the classical past provided an alternative source of inspiration to the visual devices used to ornament tomb monuments in Catholic mortuary culture. Whilst there are some recorded objections made for the use of pagan imagery on tomb monuments in 17th century England, their use was permissible in the extramural and largely secularly governed spaces of Greyfriars Kirkyard. So this slide demonstrates prudence, one of the virtues on top the little mausoleum. The 4 sculpted stone figures that once stood atop the corners of the little mausoleum have suffered from inaccurate attribution and outright slurs in historical descriptions of the monument. The Edinburgh Graveyard Guide dubs them 4 grim women and suggests they are representations of folkloric tales of 4 sisters who horribly poisoned their father, shown on the effigy below. Apart from unfounded attributions of criminality, the figures are variously listed as mourners by Historic Environment Scotland and by the Royal Commission on Ancient Monuments as figures of justice, mercy, peace and love. Most recently in 2018, they were marked as justice, mercy, faith and love. Though some of the forms are fragmented and marked from centuries of exposure to the Scottish climate, there's a remarkable softness and sensitivity in the rendering of these blocky stone statues. However, the southeast back left corner of the monument is bereft of decoration. The figure that once stood there is now headless and relegated to the gravel floor of the enclosure. And as for the figure at the monument's southwest corner, only her bottom half remains. According to the photographic evidence from 1856 and 1912, it appears that the southeast figure was in place. However, the majority of the damage was suffered before in the centuries preceding this. Despite the condition of the figures, a combination of first-hand investigation, close looking, and examination of archival, photographic, and illustrated images has facilitated a determination of their correct identities. All the figures are uniformly sculpted of the same height, dress, and styling, with laurel crowns adorning their hair. Thus, we can with some confidence conclude that they don't represent real women, but as the Royal Commission suggested, are personifications. As to determine which virtues these figures personify, it's important to examine each figure's attributes, as well as the potential meaning of the 4 figures together within early modern established conventions. The identification of the northeastern figure as justice here, so I'm just showing you one of the figures that is now on the floor of the monument. So we identify this figure as justice, supported by the scale she holds, and her sight blindfolded against prejudice with the sword she carries for the just deliverance of punishment. However, examining the attributes of the remaining 3 figures suggests alternative identifications for those detailed in existing scholarship. The northwest figure is shown to be holding snakes in her left hand, and though the item is now missing in the monument today, examining this photograph, we can see that she's holding a mirror in her right. If we look to existing early modern evidence, we can see that this figure is most likely Prudence, shown here in a tapestry held in the National Museum, holding a mirror and with an Ouroboros, a snake, in her hand also. So we've identified that figure. The figure that once stood on the southwest corner, now on the enclosure floor, I think I've gone past her, is Fortitude. She's holding a column. Finally, though it's difficult to decipher the identity of the last figure, when considered in conjunction with the other 3 virtues thus far established, it becomes clear she is Temperance, the last of the Cardinal Virtues. The carved attribute she holds in her right hand, that has the appearance of some sort of calligraphic letter, is actually a horse's bridle. Through careful examination, it's clear that these 4 figures, which adorn the little canopy, are the cardinal virtues of justice, prudence, fortitude, and temperance. Correct identification of the 4 figures of the little mausoleum as the cardinal virtues raises some fascinating potential lines of inquiry. The cardinal virtues were in common use within continental sepulchral sculpture during the early modern period, particularly this incarnation of temperance, sorry, I'll pop back a slide, shown with a horse's bridle. English examples typically show her pouring liquid between vessels. So could the sculpted virtues atop the little mausoleum have been derived from an inspiration brought to Edinburgh by foreign craftsmen? If this was true, does this suggest a level of autonomy and input into the monument's design on behalf of potentially continental masons? However, we look to Salisbury, it's possible that the visual precedent for these figures may be found closer to home and may have been potentially requested by William Little IV himself. The Cardinal Virtues figure on a number of English tombs and English nobles, appearing as kneeling figures here, bearing the effigy of Sir Robert Cecil within the Salisbury Mortuary Chapel of St. Etheldreda's in Hatfield. I probably pronounced that wrong. And also positioned on the upper layer of the monument in Salisbury Cathedral, dedicated to Sir Thomas Sturges and his wife Helena. Understood as embodying the necessary characteristics of great leaders, the cardinal virtues are the enduring attributes that justify taking a role in government. These attributes should be exhibited in life, and they ensure one's memorialization after death. The adoption of these archetypes from the monuments of the nobility again evidences William Little IV's affirmation of the Little's positions in the late 17th century society and his further aspirations for the family's social ascent, displaying how the Little Mausoleum was not only shaped by the environment in which it was created, but actively assumes a prospective attitude concerned with negotiating change in that same environment. In summation, through correctly identifying the cardinal virtues atop the Little monument, we further demonstrate the patron's intention to communicate the Little descendants' capacity for leadership, as had been evidenced through their ancestor, William Little, and also his brother, Clement Little. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. That was really, really, really interesting. I really enjoyed that. Right, I'm going to call Susan in as well, as I'm quite conscious that this fantastic day is coming to an end. We are going to do some questions and answers. Just very quickly before that, I want us all to thank Susan and Rebecca for the wonderful conference that they've put on for us today. So if we could all just have a quick raise of hands just now. That's great. Thank you so much, guys. So, right, going to the questions here. We aren't going to get through everybody's questions. So what has been suggested by ourselves is if you could actually email in your questions to Edinburgh World Heritage, they can be passed on to the speaker that the question relates to, and we'll certainly get them back to you as soon as possible. So I think this first one is from Fran, and I think this would be for Ennis. Highly ornamental memorials of this type are seen in other parts of Scotland, but often not so skillfully made. Do you think this was a fashion that spread throughout Scotland from Greyfriars? I work in St Magnus Cathedral in Orkney, and we have some amazing carved memorials that have stylistic similarities, and they date from about 1620s to 1660s.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, we can hear you now, yes.
No, that's very nice. What I think, and I'm very possibly completely wrong, but what I think is that, well, as I see it, basically you've got the Royal Centre in Edinburgh, the Premier Royal Centre, which means you've got the Premier Royal, well, architects and craftsmen based there. And so what's going on in the 1610s, 20s, 30s, 40s is that these guys are Edinburgh based. They'll travel, but they're still Edinburgh based. So like going to Pincaitlin, that's okay, just down the road. Going to the West Highlands, that's something like that. That's very difficult, and that tended not quite so much to happen. Something like Carnassery showing 1570s court style is really unusual in the West. So it tended to be quite localized, but yes, folk would move, but it wasn't spread. It wasn't spread throughout the country, and so in a way, it's unremarkable that Greyfriars has got that sort of dazzling collection that nowhere else can quite compete with. Is that answering the question?
I certainly believe so.
Okay.
Right. It's quite a long question for Christina. I know that she's already seen it. So for Christina, fascinating talk. This is from Robert. Would you be willing to consider using the term Baroque to some of the styles and designs that you've been describing? It used to be said, possibly rather loosely, that we have very little Baroque in Scotland, in contrast to my second country, Poland. Because of Scotland's dominant, I can't even say that word, dominity. Oh, it's been a long day. Calvinistic Presbyterian culture, which Poland had little of, but did have some in the 60s and 70 years after 1560 or so. This is a broad, rather loose question, but someone who is a geographer rather than an architectural historian, but I'd love to hear your comments. You're still on mute, Christina.
I have seen that. Yeah, thank you, Robert, for that. I put actually in the chat the title of a paper I did, because what I'm saying about Bethune monument is the first Baroque monument. So it's definitely, I try not to use the word, I think we have a variety of public, not to go into, styles of architectural, just more about the overall concept, but definitely this mixture of influences. And the thing is, most of them are mural, the ones I've been looking at. The Baroque, the light is very important. And we notice, for example, in Hollywood, we see a lot of this chiaroscuro, these devices that the Baroque use just with light. And actually, Chris, I will be interested to do a bit of trial with your monument in terms of lighting, because that could be quite definitive. And also with Taggy in the ones are more edicles. So yeah, definitely is that, within that kind of wider classification of architecture terms, yeah.
That's great. Chris, I kind of see that you already answered your question there, but I'm going to read it out because it is an interesting one. So Penelope says, I'm interested in James Bremner and his family, many of whom were apparently buried in the Milne tomb from the 1820s. What are the best sources of finding the history of these memorials and what relocation might have gone on?
Well, the best source would be Scotland's People, but I did this research with the because there are adjoining monuments. There's the Milne monument, and then there's the Bremner monument just in front of it. So I have attempted to try and research that, and so I'm happy to share information on the work which I have done to date.
That's also wonderful. And Taggy, we haven't had any more questions. Susan, do you have one that you could put to Tarragon for us?
What do you think was really the motivation for picking the series of allegorical figures that the Little Tomb includes? What was you think the statement being made was?
Well, I think it is in that train of the Cardinal Virtues being used to communicate the fitness of those interred and also their descendants for roles in leadership and governance. I think that's really the key message that was being communicated. I'm really interested. My supervisor was a specialist in French medieval sculpture, and she said that particularly the demonstration of temperance with a horse's bridle is a very specifically continental trope. And so it does get me to wonder why, particularly were they looking to France, Catholic France and Catholic iconography to demonstrate the Cardinal Virtues? Because of course the Cardinal Virtues precede Catholicism. They've got their roots in antiquity, but they were used in Catholic iconography. So I'm very interested in the potential for Masons to have taken their skills from the continent to Scotland. And yeah, it just shows that you can answer one question and it just promotes the asking of so many more. I was just going to say in the chat, I think someone asked about who's responsible for looking after the monuments. And I actually met him. He granted me access to the enclosure so I could have a look inside and take some better photographs. It's a chap called Andrew Hugh, and he's responsible by himself for all the monuments in Edinburgh, and it's a huge undertaking. And I think he's just spends a lot of the time sort of in the office, not actually being able to do or coordinate much of the maintenance work. But yeah, it's a huge undertaking for him to do by himself. But yeah, he's doing his absolute best. I think it's likely something to do with funding and resourcing.
I think it's complicated, isn't it? Because all of the monuments belong to the descendants. They're all in private ownership, so they belong to the descendants of the kind of lair owner. But as Henry Littlejohn was saying in 1863, the problem is that these families die out. So then who steps forward to take over responsibilities? And I think we've probably reached a kind of suitable time now to kind of draw the conference to a close with something that kind of touches very much on that question. And I think that, well, we've all been on a really shared journey today, haven't we? We've learned something new. We've posed new questions in our heads. We've looked at things that have prompted us to value something new about this space. I think we've all been concerned about the rate of deterioration that's taking place in the graveyard and the need to act. But I'm hoping that what we've also realised is that there isn't one organisation or one individual that needs to step up to ensure that the future of Greyfriars Kirkyard is ensured. This is a shared space and a shared responsibility. There's a community of interest here that we're building, and hopefully what we can do is to kind of pull together this impetus now of focus on the graveyard to work together collectively to try and improve the condition and the future of Greyfriars Kirkyard. And I want to stress that there's something that each and every single one of us can do. None of us can't contribute something. So get in touch with Edinburgh World Heritage and tell us what it is that you value about this site. Because the thing is, the more that we can show how this graveyard matters, then the more it does matter. And it becomes easier to generate resources to improve the management of the site. The Friends of Greyfriars Kirkyard are actively looking for members to volunteer, to get involved and support their work in the future. Edinburgh World Heritage is running its making lasting impressions projects for the next 18 months. This is a supportive initiative where there'll be lots of community activities that you can get involved with, and to produce information that will help our understanding of the graveyard, provide important documentary information to improve our understanding. There are practical tasks you can do to improve the physical condition of the graveyard. We can do more to communicate its value to others through new, more inclusive storytelling. There is something that everybody can do, and I am going to be back in touch with every single person who has come along today and who has registered, and I am going to coordinate your enthusiasm and your interest so that we can work together and do something to make a difference for this site. I can't thank speakers today enough for focusing our attention on Greyfriars in the enlivening and enriching way that they have. It has been amazing. It's completely exceeded my expectations and hope for the day. And I really am so grateful to you all. Thank you so very much. And, you know, I've been looking at the comments and I've just been smiling for the whole of today. And my mouth hurts now. I need to just go away and pour myself a gin and relax. And I hope all the speakers can go and find themselves a kind of sort of a celebratory tot as well, because you've done amazingly. Thank you so much to everybody who's participated. I'm going to spend the rest of the weekend reading your comments and I will be back in touch. Thank you all so very, very much.